Hello and welcome to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lebel. Germany's foreign minister has signaled that he would like to see a thaw in NATO-Russia relations, but added the ball is in Russia's court. Really? Also, as tensions over Taiwan increase, who is pushing for a military showdown? To discuss these issues and more, I'm joined by my guest, Marcus Papadopoulos in London. He is a historian, analyst, and author of the new book, Arise, Russia, The Return of Russia to World Politics. And here in Moscow, we cross to Dmitry Babich. He is a political analyst and editor at InnoSME Internet Media Project. All right, gentlemen, crosstalk rules in effect. That means you can jump in anytime you want, and I always appreciate it. Okay, let's go to Marcus first in London. So the German foreign minister wants a thaw in NATO-Russia relations, but the ball is in Russia's court. Now, can you explain to our audience why that seems so odd or actually upside down? Go ahead, Marcus.
Well, we should all be hoping for, indeed praying for, a thaw in relations between NATO and Russia, because the preservation of global peace to a very large extent depends on an improvement in ties between the Western military bloc and the Russian Federation. However, it is simply ludicrous for the German foreign minister to argue that the ball is in Russia's court, when in truth, the ball is in NATO's court. Firstly, it is not Russia who has violated the NATO-Russia Founding Act of 1997. Indeed, it is NATO, because NATO now has a permanent military presence in Eastern Europe on Russia's western borders. And that is a major violation of the agreement of 1997 between NATO and Russia. Further, it is not Russia which has a Russian-led military alliance on, for example, America's border or Germany's border or Britain's border. So in fact, the ball is in the court of NATO. But then NATO and the German foreign minister are not sincere when they say that they want a thaw in relations. They understand the level, the atrocious level of relations between NATO and Russia. And they know that if there is to be a thaw, then NATO has to take the first step. So we can dismiss what the German foreign minister said as merely propaganda. And Russia will not tolerate any sort of suggestion, a hollow suggestion, that the ball is in Russia's court. Russia will stipulate to NATO two requirements for there to be a thaw in relations. Firstly, that NATO withdraws its military forces from the western border of Russia. And secondly, Moscow will stipulate to NATO that NATO's leaders, in particular, of course, America, put into writing that the Western military bloc will not seek the admission into its ranks of Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova. Unless those two requirements are met, alas, there will be no thaw in relations between the Western military bloc and Russia.
You know, Dima, I mean, how do you think the Russian foreign ministry is receiving this? Because it's Russia that has a lot of complaints with NATO. I don't know what Russia possibly could do to irritate the NATO alliance. Okay, and it's all they're about expansion and their inability to come to some kind of security arrangement, which the Russians have been talking about since the year 2000. Okay, a number of overtures, including a time when Medvedev was president here. So, I mean, how is the Russian foreign minister going to accept this? I mean, it seems to me really quite hollow. Everyone wants a thaw in tensions, but I mean, what does that mean? What does that practically mean? And since this is a relationship of sorts, that means both sides should be committed to something. Go ahead, Dima.
Well, I think we are going through a very important, crucial period in Russian diplomacy, in the history of Russian diplomacy, because in the last 2 or 3 weeks, our foreign minister, Lavrov, made several statements which differ from the previous political line of Russia. I mean, Russia is still making the last efforts to get Western countries, especially the EU member countries, on track. Putin talked this week to the chairman of European Council, Charles Michel, And Putin suggested what he called non-politicized, non-confrontational relationship between Russia and the EU. But I think Putin himself knows that this is not the case right now. That's why our Foreign Minister Lavrov said this week that relations between Russia and the EU as an organization are, I'm quoting, practically dead. So there are some good relations on the bilateral level between Russia and several EU members, but the EU itself is a very aggressive organization. I would say, I would call it a legal arm of NATO, in its dealings with Russia. And the latest message from Russia is that indeed the ball is in your court because you are breaching the spirit of the founding act on Russia-NATO relations, signed in 1997 in Paris by President Yeltsin and the presidents of 7 Western, biggest countries. In that statement, basically NATO obliged itself not to expand, its military infrastructure to the east. That's why Russia later acquiesced basically to the inclusion first of Hungary, Poland, and Czech Republic in 1999, and later the Baltic countries in 2004 into the NATO alliance. The idea was that these countries would become more peaceful when they feel themselves under NATO's umbrella. But the opposite was the case. I mean, look at the statements that we hear from Poland, that we hear from the Baltic states. Poland says it wants American nuclear weapons on its territory. And why do they want it? They say, we didn't sign NATO-Russia Founding Act in 1997. So we're free of the obligation not to have American nuclear weapons on our territory.
So let me get this straight. They're part of NATO, but they're not obliged to follow the directives of the alliance itself. I mean, that's wanting to have your case.
It's just great. The law has a retroactive force for them. Since they were not members of NATO in 1997, when the agreement was signed, they say they're free to deploy American nuclear weapons on their territory. According to the Stockholm Institute for Peace Research, Russia's military expenditure is just 27% of what NATO's European allies spend on their defense in Europe. So who is a threat to whom here? However, this week, we again heard the statement from NATO's foreign ministers on the 22nd of March, if I'm not mistaken, that basically Russia is a threat to NATO alliance. The General Secretary of NATO said that Russia's behavior in the last few years has been getting more and more aggressive. And basically, my impression is that willingly or unwillingly, the wise people in the United States and in the EU, they feel like they're being sucked into some kind of a maelstrom, out of which they cannot get out.
That's such a good point. Let me go back to Marcus here. Dima's absolutely right here, because there's this tension is that, of course, they don't want to get into, nobody wants to get into an actual conflict, but at the same time, to keep the alliance together, to have some kind of unity, they have to have an enemy, and that enemy conveniently is Russia. And so they can't.
And China. No.
Well, yeah, okay, we'll get to that later. But there's that tension right there, because if there is a thaw and tensions go down, then NATO, well, what is it for? Okay, and as Dima pointed out, now they're going to think about taking on China because, this is an alliance since the end of the Cold War in search of a mission, and that mission is Russia. Go ahead, Marcus.
Allow me, first of all, Peter, to clarify something. One of the major reasons as to why Russia acquiesced in the late 1990s and the early 2000s, NATO expansion into Eastern Europe and indeed into the Baltic states is because the Russia of the 1990s and the early 2000s was totally different to the Russia of today. Russia was not in a position to resist the dangerous expansion, eastward expansion of NATO, politically, economically, and militarily. If the Russia of today existed in the late 1990s with President Putin at its head, then the history textbooks could look very different. But of course, it is the case that NATO exists today to counter the newly resurrected superpower status of Russia. That is the reason for its existence. And indeed, recently, the world was witness to the 22nd anniversary of NATO's illegal and murderous bombing campaign against Serbia. Now, NATO didn't just violate international law when it bombed Serbia in 1999. It violated Article 1 of the NATO treaty, which states clearly and unambiguously that NATO will never use military force to resolve disputes. So NATO has demonstrated, not just to Russia, but to the entire world, its murderous and criminal credentials. And of course, because Russia is again in 2021 a superpower, in order to try and contain Russia in Europe and thereby contain Russia in the world, the defense budget of NATO has to increase. And in order to justify to the British public, the American public, the German public, the reasons for an increase, there has to be an enemy. And Russia fits the bill perfectly of this perceived enemy.
But Dima, I mean, what could the Russian side, let's take it at face value. They're searching for a thaw. I mean, what concretely could Russia possibly do? I mean, you have the most expensive, vast military alliance in modern history directed against it. I mean, what is Russia supposed to do? I mean, particularly when the new front is the Black Sea, and then we have in the Baltic, I think in Norway now you have B-52s. I mean, and Russia's the aggressor. I mean, I don't understand. What could Russia possibly do to show goodwill if, in fact, what we're getting from the German foreign minister is goodwill as well? Go ahead.
Well, basically, just one small, not correction, but addition to what Marcus has just said. NATO in 1999 bombed not only Serbia, but also Montenegro, which was formerly still a part of Yugoslavia. And even though the Montenegrin president, Đukanović, a mafioso, was basically pro-Western, and he stays in power now for 32 years. Quick memo to those in the United States who say that Putin is staying in power for too long. Look at your Đukanović, he's staying in power for 32 years. Well, Đukanović was their ally, but they still bombed Montenegro. So basically, it's a good lesson to everyone. If you want to appease NATO, if you want to please them, it doesn't mean they're not going to bomb you.
Well, Dima, I mean, the fact of the matter is, I'm glad you brought up that footnote for us, because it shows that there's, at the end of the day, NATO doesn't feel that it is obligated to anyone to explain its existence. Okay.
But
right,
coming back to what you just said.
We're going to go to a short break, and after that short break, we'll continue our discussion on some real news. Stay with our team.
When old truths seem wrong, when old rules just don't hold, and a new world is yet to shape out, disdain becomes the etiquette, and engagement equals betrayal. When so many find themselves worlds apart, we choose to look for common ground.
Welcome back to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter LaBelle. This is the home edition, and we're discussing real news. Okay, let's go back to Marcus here. Let's change gears, gentlemen. We had a week ago the disastrous summit meeting of China and the United States in the American city of Anchorage. I think it's widely agreed, maybe from very many different perspectives, it was a real train wreck, but it had to be expected here. And now we have American, British warships in exercises around Taiwan, an agreement between the United States and Taiwan about Coast Guard exercises. It's heating up here. But, you know, Marcus, one of the things that I find very troubling is that the lack of knowledge or the inability to actually look at the origins of U.S.-Chinese relations. Since the revolution, it was under the Carter administration where diplomatic relations were established. And when that was happening, it was accepted. And it was accepted when Nixon went to China, that Taiwan is part of China, okay? And as far as the Chinese are concerned, the 1949 revolution has not been completed. It has not been able to regain control, sovereign control of its own soil. That is never told to Western publics whatsoever. So this would be akin to the Chinese having interest to have Hawaii brought in under its wing. I mean, there's this patent lack of respect of sovereignty here. Go ahead.
Yes, I think it's extremely important, Peter, for Crosstalk's audience to know very clearly that Taiwan is Chinese sovereign territory. There is no dispute about that. There is no legal standing for anyone in either America or in Britain to counter that. And as a result of Taiwan being Chinese sovereign territory, China is well within its rights to use military force to reclaim Taiwan. I'm not saying I would agree with that. I do not believe the Chinese government wishes to pursue that course of action. But it is no different to how the Syrian government is well within its rights to use military force to liberate the northeast part of Syria, where the Americans are, and the northwest of Syria, where the Turks and Al-Qaeda is. And in recent days, we've heard senior military officials in America arguing that China no longer respects the status quo over Taiwan and has instead opted to use military force to settle the issue. The problem with that is that those same American military officials have not corroborated their claims with any substantial evidence whatsoever. Yes, it is true that on China's southern borders, the Chinese government has increased its military forces. But the question, Peter, is why? And I cite the simple argument, action, reaction, because of the expansion of the American military in the South China Sea, combined, of course, with Britain increasing its military presence there.
Well,
that is very aggressive posturing from Washington and London.
Why is Britain sending warships into the Straits of Taiwan? I'm sorry, I don't understand that. What are you guys doing there?
I believe that Britain still considers itself to be a very influential player in that part of the world. Why? Because of the Opium Wars and because Britain is
nothing
still
to be proud of.
Nothing to be proud of. Nothing to be proud of. But let's not forget, Peter, that that Britain has never apologized for the Opium Wars and has never shown any regret for its devilish behavior in the Opium Wars. And Britain is also looking to foment political instability in Hong Kong, which, along with America, they have succeeded in doing.
Yes. You know, Dima, the thing is, if you look at the main broadsheets in the UK, the United States, cable TV, they talk about democracy in Hong Kong. And actually, you could see during the disturbances about a year ago with the Union Jack being waved around here. Dima, I'm sorry, but the British imperialism brought no democracy to Hong Kong. Okay, it was never ever there. So I don't know what they're talking about when it comes to democracy. It was an empire, and there was no legacy of British democracy for Hong Kong whatsoever. Again, this meddling as if Hong Kong is somehow separate from China. It is not. It's an integral part of China. When diplomatic relations, I go back to when diplomatic relations were established with communist China, there was a recognition of its sovereignty that included Hong Kong, that included Taiwan. But nobody seems to know that in media these days. Okay, go ahead, Dima.
Well, you are right, not only in diplomatic terms, in terms of international law, but also if we take the purely human side of the problem. There are still anti-Chinese, anti-Russian, pro-Western newspapers published in Hong Kong. Mm-hmm. There are free elections in Hong Kong where people supporting the protests are getting their part of the vote, right? So nothing terrible happened to Hong Kong from any point of view, except the Western sanctions, which are destroying this former paradise on earth, and Hong Kong may not be as rich as it used to be, not because of China, but because of the West. The same story with Taiwan. Basically, China has been investing tens of billions, if not hundreds of billions of dollars into Taiwanese economy. China economically is not interested in a war. It has not been preparing for a war. So the American and the British military presence is purely anti-Chinese. It's not in any way protecting anyone there. But what was interesting during this meeting in Alaska, I think the most interesting look at it was taken by a columnist of the Wall Street Journal, Jared Baker, who wrote an opinion piece titled "Western Culture Elites Are Giving Away Lenin's Rope." Well, basically, he noticed that during this meeting, Yang Jiechi, the Communist Party's foreign affairs, top man in China, basically lectured Anthony Blinken on America's human rights record, on its treatment of minorities, its system innate, racism. Everything he said could have been lifted straight from the pages of the Democratic Party's presidential election platform. So Blinken had nothing to respond, which shows you how actually radical, how big the limitations, the ideological limitations are for Blinken, So Blinken could only say that Jiechi was breaching the protocol. He was talking too long. He did not offer a single argument against it, because the moment when he offered it, he would be breaching the Democratic Party's platform. But I will very quickly, it's very interesting, that as I said in the beginning of our conversation, there are some people in the United States and in Europe who understand how dangerous it is, and they're making the last-ditch effort to stop the United States from getting into confrontation with two powers, with Russia and China. Our foreign minister had a hero's welcome last week in China when he came right after the meeting in Anchorage. So this meeting was very well timed. And after that, we have an article in Foreign Policy authored by Richard Haas and Charles Kupchan, two foreign policy bigwigs of the United States. I'm not going to give you their titles, but they're serious people. The article is headlined "A New Concept of Powers." And what do they suggest? They suggest that basically we return to non-ideological, non-confrontational rule of the world with six powers ruling.
That's a good point, Dima, but you're almost arguing against yourself in a way. Let me go to Marcus here. That the people are so ideological that they're so ideological that they can't even consonant a debate. That's why there's always this knee-jerk response for a military reaction, because they're not interested in conversation. They're not interested in debate. They're not interested in having someone point out their gross rank hypocrisy. Okay, not that I'm going to agree with everything that the Chinese delegation had to say, but if you live in a glass house, you shouldn't throw stones, and that's what Mr. Blinken should have learned, and I hope he did. Go ahead, Marcus.
Yes, the Americans and the British are not genuine when they purport to claim to be beacons of democracy and beacons of human rights and as the guardians of international law. in truth, it is all about preserving Western global hegemony. And the reason as to why the Americans and the British are increasing their military presence in the South China Sea is to contain China. No different to how NATO is attempting to contain Russia in Europe. But then there is no threat from Russia. There is no threat from China. And I would draw another similarity between China and Russia. Russia's Achilles heel remains the North Caucasus. Even though the region has been to a very large extent pacified, it wouldn't take much there for a serious conflict to erupt. And that is why in the 1990s, and even today, Western special services are still looking to foment a war in the North Caucasus. And at the same time, the Americans and the British understand that China's Achilles heel is Xinjiang. And that is why they are alleging that the Chinese government is persecuting the Muslim region, the Muslim population of this region, and has established concentration camps there. Again, the Americans and the British have not provided any substantial evidence of any kind whatsoever to corroborate that claim. Indeed, the Chinese are fighting terrorists in Xinjiang, notably Islamist terrorists comprised of ISIS cells and Al-Qaeda cells. And if they are successful in Xinjiang in defeating the Chinese security forces there, then that would pose a grave threat to Chinese territorial integrity.
Marcus,
Americans and the British know that.
It's no coincidence that Uyghurs were fighting in Syria, okay? There's no coincidence about that, okay? No one likes to point out that inconvenient truth, okay? All right, Dima, I want you to finish up. 30 seconds, go ahead.
Yeah, well, I agree. Marcus is quite right. There is evidence that terrorists from Xinjiang or Uyghur origin took part in the civil war in Syria. And again, unfortunately, the concept of powers which Mr. Haas and Mr. Kapchan are suggesting is not possible now ideologically, because they created in the United States a system which represses even the thought about it, even the thought about what they call non-confrontational, realistic, manageable geopolitical order, which can sustain ideological differences. Unfortunately, we are worse off than in the 19th century, when the concept of powers established by Russia preserved peace in Europe for 100 years.
Jump in here, gentlemen. I want to thank Marcus and Dima for joining us here. I want to thank our viewers for watching us here. See you next time. Remember, cross-talk rules.